The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the particular exhaustion of a hospital on its third shift of the morning. Cedar Creek Medical's ICU wing existed in a state of perpetual half-light, where the outside world felt impossibly distant. Natalie Hayes arrived at 6:36 a.m. like she did every Tuesday through Saturday, her badge clipped to navy scrubs, her dark hair pulled back tight enough to reveal the faint scar that ran along her left temple. Nobody ever asked about the scar. Nobody ever asked about much of anything. She pushed through the double doors and the antiseptic smell hit first, then the rhythm, the soft beeping of monitors, the wheeze of ventilators, the distant voice of the night shift nurse giving report in the break room down the hall. 17 ICU beds. 12 occupied. 3 critical. Natalie knew them all by bed number and vitals, the way other people knew their children's names. Room for 47 was in the west corridor, 4th bed from the emergency exit. The chart on the door said Colonel Marcus Webb, 68, admitted 11 days ago with shrapnel wounds and a pneumothorax that had been stabilized in trauma surgery. Classified status. No visitors beyond immediate military personnel. The orders had come printed on Pentagon letterhead. Natalie had requested this position 6 months ago. She'd been embedded here for exactly 154 days, and nobody at Cedar Creek Medical knew anything about who she actually was. Her employment file said she had an associate's degree from Georgia State, 3 years of nursing experience at a medical practice in Marietta, and impeccable references from people who would swear on anything that she existed exactly as presented. The background was airtight. Pentagon-grade airtight. The MacGuffin sat against her ribs, sewn into the jacket lining she'd left in her locker downstairs, a faded unit patch from the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, the only piece of her real identity she'd allowed herself to keep. 16 years of service. 12 of them with that patch. She could feel it there like a physical reminder of who she was supposed to be invisible about. She started her shift the way she always did, patient by patient, vitals by vitals, a quiet competence that the day shift doctors never seemed to notice. The ones who mattered had stopped noticing her the way people stopped noticing furniture. That was fine. That was the point. At 8:15 a.m., Dr. Sterling Pierce arrived for grand rounds. He moved through the corridors with the particular arrogance of someone who'd never had to prove anything to anyone who mattered. Expensive watch. Expensive shoes. Hair that cost money to make look like it hadn't required money. He was the kind of man who filled a room by walking into it, which in the real world meant very little and in hospital hierarchies meant everything. Behind him came the residents, 5 of them, notebooks ready, faces arranged in expressions of carefully managed reverence. Natalie was adjusting the 4-flow on room for 39 when she heard his voice carry down the hallway. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She knew what was about to happen. This is what happens when we lower our standards, Pierce's voice announced to the assembled residents, and her hands continued their work with the steadiness of someone who'd once performed field surgery in a Baghdad basement under artillery fire. Nurses who think watching YouTube makes them surgeons. Nurses who imagine they have clinical judgment they haven't earned. The group stopped at the nurses' station. Natalie could feel them there like a temperature change in the air. She finished typing the flow rate into the computer before she turned. Pierce was looking directly at her. His expression held the precision of a man who'd engineered this moment, calibrated it for maximum audience effect. Incompetence is dangerous in a hospital, people. It gets people killed. When someone operates outside their scope, when someone makes assumptions about their training they haven't actually earned, that person becomes a liability. One of the residents laughed. The others followed, that particular synchronized nervous laughter of people in a hierarchy responding to the person above them. Natalie felt it in her jaw, the urge to move, the urge to respond. She was better trained than everyone in this building at reading situations and predicting outcomes. 16 years of combat made you good at threat assessment. She catalogued Pierce's tells, the slight tension in his shoulders suggesting he needed this, the way his eyes held hers just a fraction too long, the angle of his body designed to keep the residents watching his reaction to her more than her reaction to him. She held his stare for 3 seconds. Not flinching. Not looking down. Not engaging. Then she turned back to room for 39 and finished documenting fluid volumes. When they'd moved down the hallway, one of the residents lingered. "That was pretty rough," he said quietly. Natalie didn't look up from the screen. "Doctors need teaching patience." He picked his topic. It wasn't a defense and it wasn't sarcasm. It was just mathematics. She was useful as a negative example. Nothing personal. Nothing that would compromise the mission. At 11:22 a.m., she purchased coffee from the vending machine in the break room, inserted her dollar bill, heard it whir and hissed like a small angry animal. Two physicians stood 3 feet away pretending they hadn't noticed her arrive. Then the taller one leaned in closer to his colleague and spoke in that volume that's technically not quite a whisper, the kind of volume that's engineered to be heard by exactly the person it's meant for. "Pierce says she's been performing procedures above her scope. Probably trying to play hero, you know? Some nurses get complex about not being doctors." The other physician nodded. "That's dangerous." They left. Natalie drank her coffee and read the room assignment on her phone. The colonel's chart was updated at 11:19 a.m. Cardiac rhythm stable. Respiratory status improving. Shrapnel removal had gone well, but Baghdad had done what Baghdad did. The damage wasn't just the wounds, it was what came with them. 6 months ago, when the Pentagon had called her at the Tactical Operations Center in North Carolina and asked if she'd do a nursing job nobody else could do, they'd explained it with the brevity of people who didn't waste words. Colonel Webb had classified information. There were concerns about security during his recovery. They needed someone trained in both medical assessment and threat analysis. Someone who could monitor his conversations without him realizing he was being monitored. She'd said yes before they finished the sentence. The afternoon shift began at 1:06 p.m. with the full weight of Cedar Creek Medical's hierarchy establishing itself through the hallways like an army occupying territory. Natalie moved through it like water through a mesh screen, present, essential, invisible. She changed dressings. She documented medications. She caught a medication error another nurse had made and corrected it quietly, without making it a thing, without letting it become an incident. The error had been a dosing calculation on a pediatric antibiotic. 2 more milliliters would have overdosed the 6-year-old in room for 32. Nobody ever knew it had almost happened. At 2:38 p.m. she entered room for 47. Colonel Marcus Webb was awake, which was a shift in his pattern. He'd slept most of the past 11 days, the morphine and pain management keeping him in that space between consciousness and mercy. But this afternoon his eyes tracked her movement across the threshold, and she registered the change in his baseline, blood pressure elevated slightly, heart rate up 8 beats per minute, pupils responsive and engaged. He was assessing her with the precision of someone whose job had been making instantaneous threat determinations for most of his adult life. She checked his vitals without rushing. She recorded them without commentary. She was reaching for the dressing change supplies when his voice came, quiet and fractured with pain medication. "Your needle angle." The words were slow. Deliberate. Different. Natalie didn't pause. She continued preparing the sterile field with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. "I'm trained on best practices, sir. Not nursing best practices." She still didn't look at him. She couldn't. There was too much exposure in direct eye contact right now, too much risk that he'd see something in her face that confirmed what he might be beginning to suspect. But her hands moved through the procedure with absolute precision, cleaning the wound site, applying fresh gauze, documenting the status, and she felt him watching her hands the way a man watches evidence. When she was finished, she did meet his eyes. For exactly 1 second. Long enough to let him see that she'd heard him. Not long enough for him to read anything else. "Get some rest, Colonel. You're healing well." She was at the door when his voice stopped her again. 7 years. She kept moving. "I don't know what you mean, sir." But they both knew. 7 years was how long combat medics with special operations units trained for a particular type of mission. 7 years was how long it took to get good enough at field surgery that your hands could find the anatomy in the dark and do what needed doing before the patient bled out. 7 years was what she was, whether she said it out loud or not. The door closed behind her and Natalie walked down the hallway toward room for 45, her breathing steady, her expression neutral, her mind already 3 steps ahead toward the next crisis point she could sense coming like a pressure system moving across water. Dr. Pierce was building something. She could feel it in the way the residents looked at her now, in the way the other nurses had stopped sitting near her at lunch. Reputations were weapons. Whispers were ammunition. She'd seen it happen before in different uniforms, different settings. Someone like Pierce didn't tolerate people like her, competent people who didn't seek attention for their competence, people whose value couldn't be measured against his credentials. And that was when the real danger would begin. Not from outside. From inside. From a man who'd made it his mission to prove that invisible people should stay that way. The hallway outside the vending machine smelled like burnt coffee and antiseptic. Natalie was reaching for her regular, black, no sugar, when she heard them. 2 physicians rounding the corner, voices pitched just loud enough to carry. Pierce says she's been performing procedures above her scope, the taller one said. His name tag read Hendricks. Orthopedics. Probably trying to play hero. Thinks watching YouTube makes her qualified for surgery. The second physician laughed. A short, cruel sound. A nurse with delusions of grandeur. That never ends well. Natalie's fingers paused on the vending machine button. The coffee dropped with a metallic clang. She didn't turn around. Didn't flinch. Didn't give them the satisfaction of knowing she'd heard. Instead, she pressed the button. Watch the cup fill. The steam rose in a thin column, carrying the bitter smell upward. She'll be gone soon enough, Hendricks continued as they passed. Pierce has documentation. Proper channels. The board won't have a choice. Their footsteps faded down the corridor. Natalie retrieved her coffee. The cup was hot enough to burn, but she held it steady. Her hands didn't shake. They never did. Not anymore. Not since Baghdad. Not since the day she'd learned that trembling was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford. She thought about the colonel in room for 47. She thought about why she was here. Not for them. Not for Cedar Creek Medical or its institutional hierarchy or its politics masquerading as professionalism. She was here because the Pentagon had embedded her 8 months ago with a single directive: monitor the patient. Listen to his morphine-induced conversations. Flag any security leaks. That was the mission. The nursing license was the cover. The scrubs were the uniform of invisibility. And now Pierce was working to strip that invisibility away. Natalie walked back to the unit. The fluorescent lights buzzed their constant hum. At the nursing station, she charted vitals for her other patients, routine, mechanical, the kind of work that required presence but not thought. Vitals at 1422. Blood pressure stable. Heart rate regular. The colonel would need his dressing changed at 3 p.m. She made a note. That's when she heard his voice. Natalie. My office. Now. Dr. Pierce stood at the end of the corridor, his white coat crisp as a blade, his expression the kind of controlled anger that people with institutional power perfected. He didn't wait for her response. He just turned and walked, assuming she would follow because of course she would. She was a nurse. He was a doctor. The hierarchy was immutable. She set her coffee down on the counter and followed him. His office was exactly what Natalie expected. Mahogany desk. Diplomas on the wall, Harvard Medical, Johns Hopkins residency, 3 fellowship certificates. A photograph of him shaking hands with the chief of surgery. Everything arranged to demonstrate superiority. Everything designed to remind you that you were the thing being examined, not the one doing the examining. Pierce closed the door behind her. The sound was definitive. Final. I've had complaints, he said. His voice carried the precision of someone who'd practiced this speech. Multiple staff members reporting inappropriate scope creep. Procedures you're performing without supervision. Overstepping your credentials. Natalie stood still. Her hands hung at her sides. She met his eyes with the kind of direct gaze that made lesser men uncomfortable. She'd learned this in the first SFODD. Eye contact was a form of communication. It meant, I am listening. I am not afraid. Furthermore, Pierce continued, his voice rising now, your attitude toward this institution is problematic. You question orders. You challenge protocols. You act as though you belong in surgical decisions that are above your pay grade. He moved toward her, invading the space between them with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no. I'm tired of it. I'm tired of watching you play doctor while real physicians have to manage the consequences of your incompetence. Natalie didn't respond. She simply watched him. Her expression didn't change. Not a flicker. Not the smallest tell. I've instructed security to escort you from the building effective immediately, Pierce said. You're suspended pending a formal review by the board. Consider this your notice that your time here is finished. He turned away from her, moving back to his desk, the dismissal implicit. His hands trembled slightly as he opened a file, anger seeking an outlet, finding paper instead. And that's when Natalie spoke. Your insecurity is showing, Doctor. The words were quiet. Soft, even. But they landed like bullets in a vacuum. Pierce's hand stilled. His spine straightened. He turned to face her, and for just a moment, the briefest fraction of a second, his face went blank. Confused. As though someone had just spoken to him in a language he didn't understand. Excuse me. You heard me. Natalie moved toward the door. She moved with the kind of precision that came from years of tactical training, each step deliberate, economical, the gait of someone who'd moved through hostile terrain and learned to waste nothing. You can file complaints. You can call security. You can invoke every regulation in the hospital bylaws. But it won't change what you already know, that you're afraid of someone doing your job better than you could ever do it. And that fear is eating you alive. She reached for the door handle. That's insubordination, Pierce said behind her. His voice had gone thin. Sharp-edged. Natalie paused. She turned her head just enough to look at him over her shoulder. The corridor fluorescence cast harsh shadows across her face. No, Doctor. That's clarity. Then she turned the handle and walked out. Behind her, she heard Pierce's breath, short and furious. She heard him begin to say something else, then stop. The silence that followed was the sound of a man realizing he'd miscalculated. That the person he'd tried to dominate had simply stepped outside the arena where his dominance mattered. The security team was waiting at the main exit. 2 officers in gray uniforms, professional and impersonal. They didn't touch her. They didn't need to. Natalie walked out between them into the Atlanta afternoon. The sun was bright and merciless. The air was thick with late September heat. She drove home in silence, her hand steady on the steering wheel, her mind already compartmentalizing. The mission was compromised. The Pentagon would need to be notified. The colonel would be transferred, probably within 48 hours, once they understood that her cover was shredded. 8 months of embedded surveillance. Gone. Because she'd broken protocol. Because she'd chosen to defend herself instead of remaining invisible. Because she was tired of being invisible. Her apartment was a modest 2-bedroom in Buckhead, furnished with the kind of deliberate emptiness that came from a life designed to leave no trace. No personal photos. No mementos. No evidence of who she'd been before the nursing license and the scrubs and the false name on her emergency contact form. Her daughter was sitting at the kitchen table when Natalie walked in. Sophia. 7 years old. Dark hair like her mother's. Brown eyes that saw too much because her mother had trained her to see too much, a survival instinct passed down through DNA and exhaustion. Mommy. Sophia looked up from her after-school snack. Goldfish crackers arranged in careful lines on a napkin. Why are you home? It was 14:51. Natalie's shift didn't end until 7 p.m. The lie came easily. It always did. I wasn't feeling well, Natalie said. She moved to the sink, poured herself a glass of water. Her hand was steady. The water went down smooth and cold. Are you sick? Sophia's voice had changed. Concerned now. Adult adjacent. This was what happened when your parent was a soldier and a nurse and a spy all at once. Your child learned to read crisis before they learned to read. Natalie sat down across from her daughter. She looked at the goldfish crackers. She looked at Sophia's face. She thought about the mission briefing 8 months ago. The Pentagon official in the secure conference room. You'll be posing as a civilian nurse. 14-hour shifts. Your daughter will be placed in elite day care. This assignment is critical. The colonel has been compromised. We need someone on the inside. She thought about the colonel in room 447, still recovering from IED shrapnel that had torn through his legs. The same battlefield where Natalie had learned to move a needle through skin with the precision of a surgeon. The same dust where she'd held 37 soldiers together with field supplies and muscle memory and the kind of rage that only comes from watching your brothers die. I'm not sick, Natalie said quietly. I just needed to be here. Sophia reached across the table and took her mother's hand. The goldfish crackers forgotten. Can we stay home tomorrow too? Sophia asked. Natalie didn't answer. She couldn't answer. Because the next part of this story, the part where everything shifted again, was already walking through the doors of Cedar Creek Medical. The part where a colonel in a hospital bed would whisper a single word that would change everything. The part where she would be forced to choose between the mission and the man she'd saved. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd already made the choice, sitting at a kitchen table, holding her daughter's hand, realizing that some invisibilities, once broken, could never be repaired. The colonel's hand closed around her wrist at 2:14 p.m. on a Wednesday, gripping with surprising strength for a man who'd been sedated since Sunday. Natalie was changing his dressing, her movements practiced and precise, the kind of precise that came from field medicine, not nursing school textbooks. The antiseptic smell hung between them as she worked, her fingers steady on the gauze, her angle of approach to the wound exactly perpendicular, efficient, the way you learned when seconds meant the difference between a soldier walking or bleeding out in the dust. He studied her hands like he was reading a language nobody else in Cedar Creek Medical understood. His pupils were still dilated from the morphine drip, but his eyes, those gray eyes that had seen Kandahar and Sanjin Valley, tracked her movements with sudden laser focus. Colonel Marcus Webb had spent 37 years in the 1st SFODD. He knew the difference between a nurse and a combat medic the way a man knows his own reflection. You learned that angle in combat, not nursing school, he whispered, his voice rough from the breathing tube that had come out 2 days earlier. Not a question. A statement. An accusation disguised as observation. Natalie's hands didn't pause. That was the training. That was 8 years of Delta selection teaching her that the worst mistake was the visible reaction. But her pulse ticked up, and she became aware, suddenly, completely, of every camera angle in the room, every blind spot, every exit. Threat assessment. Threat response. The kind of thing you never actually unlearned. I've been a nurse for 7 years, Colonel, she said quietly, keeping her voice in that careful register she'd perfected over 6 months of Cedar Creek shifts. Deferential. Apologetic. The voice of someone who belonged in the bottom tier of the hospital hierarchy. The voice of someone hiding. 7 years. He didn't release her wrist. And before that? She set the dressing down with deliberate slowness. The gauze crinkled. The fluorescent lights above them hummed their endless fluorescent hum, indifferent and constant. Before that, I was somewhere else. The colonel's mouth tightened. He'd been briefed on the mission parameters, she knew that much. The Pentagon had told him something. Not everything. Never everything. but enough to know why a Delta operator was suddenly working as a floor nurse at a hospital in Atlanta, playing invisible, watching him, monitoring the classified conversations that leaked out between pain medication and consciousness. Enough to know she wasn't here to refill water pitchers. Medevac priority, he said, still watching her hands. Using the old terminology. Testing her. How long before cardiac arrest at current blood loss? She didn't blink. Didn't hesitate. For minutes. Maybe 5 if you're lucky and we get the pressure cuff on fast. Field dressing technique. Tourniquet above the wound, direct pressure for 90 seconds, pack the cavity if you have to. The words came automatically, and she knew, in that instant, with absolute clarity, that her cover had just cracked like thin ice. You didn't learn that in nursing school. You learned that in a combat medic course run by the Army's Special Forces Medical Sergeant, and there were maybe 3,000 people in the entire country who could recite those protocols from muscle memory alone. The colonel released her wrist. His hand fell back to the bed, the morphine still pulling at his consciousness, but his eyes stayed locked on hers. "What's your call sign?" he asked. The room went very still. The heart monitor beeped its rhythm, 76, 77, 78, steady and even and utterly betraying. Somewhere down the corridor, a staff member laughed about something inconsequential. A telephone rang. The world outside was continuing, completely unaware that everything Natalie had spent 6 months building was collapsing in real time, dissolving like sugar in water, like a mission profile that had just gone classified to blown. "I can't answer that," she said. "Can't. Or won't." She met his gaze directly, the first time in 6 months she'd let her real eyes show through the role she was playing. Not the careful, cautious nurse. The officer. The woman who'd carried wounded soldiers across 50 kilometers of hostile territory. The woman who'd made 37 combat saves and kept every single one of them alive until they hit proper medical support. "Does it matter?" she asked. The colonel smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd just completed a puzzle he'd been working on since she'd walked into his room on day 1. "No," he said. "I suppose it doesn't." She finished his dressing change in silence. The gauze went on smooth and clean, the tape securing it with soft pressure. Professional. Competent. Everything a nurse was supposed to be. When she was done, she stepped back, and the distance between them suddenly felt enormous, not the 5 feet of linoleum tile but the distance between 2 worlds. The world where she was Captain Natalie Hayes, embedded operative with Pentagon clearance and a mission file 30 pages long. And the world where she was just Natalie Hayes, RN, who changed dressings and took vital signs and tried very hard not to exist anywhere else. "Your daughter," the colonel said as she turned toward the door. 7 years old. She stopped. Every muscle locked. Threat assessment. Threat response. Analysis of the phrase "your daughter" and what it implied about how much he'd been told, how much he knew, how far the mission had really penetrated. "That's classified," she said quietly. "Everything about you is classified." He shifted in the bed, and pain flickered across his face, the real pain, not the morphine-softened version. "But you're still here. You're still doing the job. Which means you're still willing to sacrifice things that matter to do it." She didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Because he was right, and they both knew it. She'd been willing to sacrifice her daughter's stability, her own mental health, her sense of self, to monitor him, to watch for the security leaks that were supposed to come out of his morphine-hazed conversations. To be invisible. To be nobody. Except now somebody was looking directly at her and seeing everything. She left the room without responding, her badge clipping against the collar of her scrubs with a soft metallic tap. In the hallway, she forced her breathing to stay level. In. Out. In. Out. The way they'd taught her at Fort Bragg. The way you learned to survive when your identity was nothing but a story you told over and over until you almost believed it yourself. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the colonel, a man with 37 years of combat experience and the rank to back it up, had just confirmed what she'd been terrified of since the moment she set foot in Cedar Creek Medical. She wasn't hidden well enough. She wasn't invisible enough. And in a hospital where Dr. Pierce was already hunting for ways to destroy her credibility, where he was already building a documentation trail that would end her career, where he was already whispering poison to anyone who would listen, being seen was the same thing as being caught. Tuesday morning started like any other shift at Cedar Creek Medical. Natalie clocked in at 6:53, hung her jacket in her locker, the faded first SFODD unit patch still sewn inside the lining where only she could see it, and walked toward the colonel's room on the 4th floor. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. Room for 47. She'd checked on him 17 times in the past 4 weeks, each visit a careful balance between nurse and operative, surveillance and care. The monitors showed steady vitals. Good. The colonel was sleeping. She adjusted his foredrip, noted his numbers in the chart, and was turning to leave when his hand moved. Not a sleep reflex. A grab. His grip on her wrist was weak but purposeful. His eyes weren't fully open, but they were locked on hers with the clarity of someone who'd spent 30 years reading threats in darkness. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. His fingers moved across her forearm, tracing the calluses there, the muscle memory scars that no nursing school textbook could teach. She'd pulled away from that conversation yesterday, deflected, denied. Today was supposed to be different. Today she was supposed to be invisible again. She wasn't. At 11:34, the colonel's monitor began screaming. His chest rigid. Trachea deviated left. Oxygen saturation dropping like a stone, 94, 89, 82, 76. Tension pneumothorax. The lung was collapsing, pushing against his heart, suffocating him from the inside out. Natalie was 3 steps away when she heard Dr. Pierce's voice from the doorway, already calling for imaging, already reaching for his phone to page cardiothoracic, already trapped in the paralysis of protocol. Get respiratory, Pierce said. Not a command. A hope. The colonel's lips were turning blue. His eyes found hers across the chaos of monitors and beeping alarms. Not a patient looking for rescue. A soldier looking at a soldier. Natalie moved. She didn't wait for permission. Didn't ask Pierce to authorize. Didn't call for backup or follow the chain that protocol demanded. Her hands already knew what to do. 14-gauge angiocath needle. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The anatomy was the same whether you learned it in a combat field hospital in Fallujah or in an Atlanta teaching hospital. The human body's vulnerabilities never changed, the physics of collapsed lung pressure never changed, the mathematics of survival never changed. Muscle memory took over. She prepped the skin with alcohol swab. Her hand steady as a surgical laser, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of a trauma specialist who'd done this in the dark under fire. The needle went in. There was resistance, then breakthrough, then the sound that saved lives. The hiss of air escaping. Pressure released. The colonel's chest rose. The monitors chimed back to life, oxygen climbing, 91, 96, 98. His color returned like a door opening on a better world. The trachea drifted back to center. The monitors showed normal sinus rhythm, steady and strong. Sinus rhythm, someone whispered. The room went dead silent. Nobody moved. The respiratory therapist's hand froze over the crash cart. The nursing assistant's breath caught. Dr. Pierce's phone slipped from his fingers and clattered on the tile floor, the sound like a judge's gavel closing on something final. Natalie kept her hand steady on the needle, her eyes on the colonel's face. He was breathing. Alive. The mission stayed intact, the asset survived. But something else had died in that room, something about her invisibility, her cover, the careful compartmentalization that had kept both her identities separate. The colonel's eyes were open. Clear. He brought his hand up and gripped her arm again, but this time he whispered a single word. Reaper. Not a name. A call sign. A ghost from Baghdad. The code she'd used on her last official operation with the first SFODD before she'd gone dark, before she'd become just a nurse, before the Pentagon had quietly reassigned her to this hospital to monitor for potential security breaches in the colonel's post-mission conversations. She pulled her hand back. "Wrong person," she said quietly. But her voice had changed. It wasn't the voice of the deferential nurse who apologized for existing. It was the voice of someone who'd killed. Who'd survived. Who knew exactly what the next 14 minutes were going to cost her. Dr. Pierce's face had gone from white to purple in the space of a breath. He was staring at her with the look of a man who'd just realized he'd been playing chess against someone from an entirely different game. His hands were shaking. Not from fear. From rage. From the understanding that she'd just committed a violation so complete, so unambiguous, that even the colonel's continued existence wouldn't save her from the machinery he was about to activate. "You don't have authority for that procedure," Pierce said. His voice was quiet. Dangerous. The patient needed. "I don't care what the patient needed. You are not a doctor. You are not a paramedic. You performed an invasive procedure outside your scope of practice and you did it without my authorization." He moved toward the door, already reaching for his phone. "Security will be here in 4 minutes. You're finished." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. In 4 minutes, she would be escorted from the building. In 8 hours, the complaints would be filed. In 2 days, her nursing license would be suspended pending investigation. The documentation trail that Dr. Pierce had been carefully constructing since her first day, every instance of her stepping outside protocol, every moment of initiative that looked like insubordination when filed next to 17 other incidents, would become the evidence that justified her termination. She understood. The colonel understood. This wasn't mercy. This was the bill coming due for stepping into the light. Natalie removed her badge from her pocket and set it on the bedside table. Not in anger. Not in resignation. In the same quiet, practiced way a soldier removes their call sign when a deployment ends. "Understood," she said. She didn't look at Dr. Pierce. She didn't look at the colonel. She walked out of room for 47 with her spine straight and her hand steady, moving past the nursing station where staff turned to stare, past the elevators where she could hear Pierce's voice already poisoned speaking to the chief medical officer, down to the locker room on the basement level where the fluorescent lights cast everything in a sickly yellow. 30 minutes later her locker was empty. She took the jacket with the faded unit patch. She took the framed photo of her daughter, Emma, taken 3 months ago at Stone Mountain. She took nothing else. The cardboard box weighed almost nothing at all. The rain started as soon as she hit the parking lot. Not a drizzle. A downpour. The kind of Atlanta summer rain that felt personal, like the sky itself was joining the collapse. Water ran down her neck inside her collar. Her scrubs were soaked through before she made it to her car, a 6-year-old Hyundai that smelled like old French fries and her daughter's forgotten soccer equipment. She drove to the lot behind the Greyhound station on Peach Street, parked in the back corner where the streetlights didn't reach, and sat in the dark with the engine off. The rain hammered the windshield like 1,000 fists. Her hands were still steady. Her breathing was still controlled. Everything about her training screamed that emotions were information you processed and filed away, not experiences you indulged in. But at 2:19 in the morning, in a car that smelled like failure, Natalie broke that training. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through the photos. Emma at her ballet recital, holding the microphone with a grip that was pure defiance. Emma asleep on the couch 3 weeks ago, her mouth open, unguarded, safe. Emma asking her yesterday why Mommy was home early, with a confusion in her voice that said she was smart enough to know something was wrong but too young to understand that her mother had just blown a Pentagon operation to keep a stranger alive. The cardboard box sat on the passenger seat. She opened it, found the unit patch, and held it up to the ambient light filtering through the rain. Faded green. Worn fabric. 37 embroidered names stitched around the border, soldiers she'd saved during her 3 tours of Baghdad. 37 lives that depended on her staying operational, staying invisible, staying locked in the compartment labeled Captain Natalie Hayes that was separate from the compartment labeled Mom. She almost threw it out the window. The rain was heavy enough that she could have opened the door and released it into the storm and it would have been gone forever, dissolved into the Atlanta drainage system like it never existed. Another identity cremated. Another life compartment closed. Just a nurse. Just a woman who'd made a terrible mistake at the moment it mattered most. Her eyes burned. But soldiers don't cry. She sat with the patch in her hands for 14 minutes. 14 minutes of complete stillness. 14 minutes of listening to the rain and remembering every single one of those 37 names. Not their mission briefings. Their faces. The ones who'd lived because she'd moved fast enough. The ones who'd died anyway, despite everything. The weight of 37 names was heavier than the weight of losing her job, her license, her cover, her entire life as a civilian. The colonel had whispered her call sign. Reaper. She carefully folded the patch and placed it back in the box. She wouldn't throw it away. Not tonight. Not ever. The patch was the only piece of her that was telling the truth. Everything else, the scrubs, the badge, the carefully constructed story about a nursing school graduate who'd taken an internship position in Atlanta, was a lie that had just collapsed under its own weight. She started the car. The clock on the dashboard read 2:38. That's when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong in a hospital parking lot at 2:30 in the morning. A rhythmic thudding that grew louder, closer, more insistent. Rotors. The distinctive double beat of a helicopter descending, the sound that had marked every insertion she'd ever flown to, the sound of extraction coming at last. Natalie looked up through the rain-streaked windshield. Lights in the sky, military-grade landing lights, rotating patterns that meant somebody with authority had made a phone call and somebody with access had authorized immediate deployment. She had no idea what was about to happen next. The helicopter descended toward the helipad behind Cedar Creek Medical, less than 300 yards from where she sat in her car in the rain, holding a cardboard box containing everything that was real about her. The rotors shook the windows of the parking garage. The sound was impossibly loud, impossibly real, impossibly close. In room for 47, the colonel opened his eyes and asked the first-shift nursing assistant a single question. "Where is she? The nurse who saved my life. Where is she?" And in the Pentagon, a two-star general whose name was in the classified files attached to Captain Natalie Hayes' personnel record received that question exactly 47 seconds after it was asked. The general set down his coffee. He picked up his phone. He said 7 words to the soldier on the other end of the line. "Bring her in. Code black. Full protective detail." The rotor wash shook the windows of Cedar Creek Medical's 3rd floor as Natalie sat in the chief medical officer's office, a manila envelope sliding across mahogany. Dr. Pierce's fingers, manicured, trembling with satisfaction, released it like he was handling something radioactive. 17 pages. Each one a brick in a wall he'd spent 6 months building. "Pattern of insubordination," he announced, his voice pitched for the administrative assistant typing in the adjacent room. "Scope violations. Unauthorized invasive procedures. I've cited the hospital's liability exposure twice. The board will have no choice." The chief medical officer didn't look at Natalie. He didn't have to. The paperwork was everything. Pierce had learned that lesson well. You don't destroy someone with one dramatic gesture. You destroy them with documentation. With witnesses. With the suffocating weight of institutional machinery grinding forward. Natalie's termination became official at 11:06 a.m. on a Thursday. 2 security guards, one of them actually apologetic, walked her to her locker while Dr. Pierce watched from the hallway, his arms crossed like a sculptor admiring his work. She'd had 8 months to embed herself here, 8 months to monitor Colonel Webb's morphine-loosened conversations for security leaks, 8 months of pretending to be someone she wasn't. The Pentagon had invested $847,000 in her cover identity. New credentials. A fabricated employment history. A permanent address with utilities in her real name. All of it scorched. Gone. Her hands, steady enough to save lives, now trembled as she removed her badge. Not from fear. From the weight of failure. She'd blown the mission to save the one patient she was supposed to be surveilling. The irony had teeth. At 2:13 p.m., her daughter found her at the kitchen table, still in scrubs, the afternoon light turning everything the color of old photographs. Emma was 7, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's impossible optimism. She'd been picked up from aftercare early. The school had called. Had the sitting nanny arrived yet? Had anyone called to explain that Mommy no longer worked at Cedar Creek? "Why are you home?" Emma asked, setting her backpack down carefully, like she was approaching something fragile. Natalie opened her mouth. Closed it. What do you tell a child about a cover blown? About a mission failure? About a mother who exists in two realities and is no longer welcome in either? The words wouldn't come. They tasted like blood and ash. Emma climbed into her lap, something she hadn't done in months, and Natalie held her, shoulders shaking, while outside the window a neighbor's sprinkler kicked on and off, like a heartbeat forgetting how to work. The emergency disciplinary hearing convened 72 hours later in the hospital's boardroom on the 14th floor. Natalie sat alone at one end of a polished table, Dr. Pierce opposite her with his documentation binder, forest green, labeled with her name, thick enough to require both hands. The board members filed in like jurors who'd already voted. Chief Medical Officer. 2 administrators. The head of nursing. The hospital's legal counsel. Pierce presented his case with the precision of a man who'd rehearsed every word. He walked them through the grand rounds. The needle decompression. The unauthorized procedure. The 17 policy violations. His voice never wavered. His hands were steady. This was the part where competence mattered, where bureaucracy was a weapon more effective than any blade. Captain Hayes violated the foundational scope of practice that protects every patient in this hospital, he concluded, and someone, maybe it was the lawyer, nodded slowly. The room smelled like coffee and the plastic vinyl reek of corporate furniture. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their fluorescent song. The colonel arrived in a wheelchair 47 minutes into the hearing, rolled by an attendant who didn't ask permission. James Webb, 73 years old, third-degree burns along his left side, 2 weeks post-op from a procedure that should have killed him. He moved with the precision of a man who'd spent 50 years ignoring pain. His eyes were the color of old money, silver gray, the kind that sees through walls. He positioned himself at the end of the table, next to Natalie, his presence reshaping the room's geometry. Dr. Pierce's jaw tightened. "Colonel, I'm not sure you understand the gravity of the violations," Pierce began, reaching the crescendo where Natalie would be officially terminated, where his carefully constructed case would demolish her career, where vindication would taste like expensive champagne. The colonel leaned forward in his wheelchair. "Not far. Just enough." "Reaper," he whispered. One word. The room crystallized. The board members exchanged glances, confusion, then something darker. Understanding spreading like a contagion. Natalie's eyes closed for exactly one breath. 30 years of operational security, of buried history, of compartmentalized and so complete even she sometimes forgot who she'd been, compressed into a single syllable spoken by a man who shouldn't have known. Dr. Pierce's face cycled through emotions like a traffic light, satisfaction, then confusion, then something approaching dread. A Marine liaison officer stood from the back of the room. She hadn't noticed him enter, his dress uniform the color of dress uniforms, his bearing the unmistakable posture of a man who'd spent a career carrying other people's secrets. "The board should review this citation," he said, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He read from a document, and each line landed like a hammer blow. Captain Natalie Hayes, 1st SFOD Delta, Silver Star for Vela, Combat Operations Baghdad 2019. 37 confirmed field saves. Surgical technique exceeding most combat surgeons. Awarded for extraordinary heroism. The board members were perfectly still. Dr. Pierce's hand moved to his collar, tugging at it like he couldn't breathe. "The Colonel isn't the patient here," Pierce interrupted, his voice cracking at the edges. "She's still just a two-star general." Walked through the door, his ribbons like a map of 30 years of conflict. Dress blues that looked like they'd been pressed with institutional precision. He didn't speak. He crossed the room in 6 steps and rendered a crisp military salute to Natalie, fist to his heart, the kind of acknowledgement that outweighed every word Pierce could ever speak. The legal counsel actually pushed his chair back. The boardroom had transformed from a tribunal into something else entirely. A reckoning. A reveal. A moment where bureaucracy crumbled in the presence of something harder and older and infinitely more dangerous. Pierce stood, his documentation binder sliding across the polished table, papers scattering like autumn. This is highly irregular," he stammered. Nobody was listening. That evening, Dr. Pierce's phone rang at 8:22 p.m. His old mentor from medical school, Dr. Samuel Hartwell, chief of surgery at Johns Hopkins, the man who'd written his letter of recommendation, who'd believed in him once, was on the other end. The live stream had gone viral, 847,000 views in 14 hours, and Hartwell had watched it in his office, had seen Pierce reduce a nursing staff member to tears during grand rounds, had heard the casual cruelty in his voice, and had made a decision that took roughly 6 minutes. "I'm disappointed in you," Hartwell said, and then he hung up. That call triggered an immediate ethics board review. 3 days later, it escalated to the state licensing board. 5 days after that, his hospital privileges came under scrutiny. The bureaucratic machinery that Pierce had learned to weaponize, death by 1,000 forms, regulations cited and violations documented, turned around and consumed him. 6 months later, Dr. Marcus Pierce was driving a white Ford Transit van with MedSupply Solutions stenciled on the side in fading blue lettering. The name tag on his polo shirt read Marcus. Nobody called him doctor anymore. His routes took him through rural Georgia, small clinics, county facilities, places where nobody had heard of Cedar Creek Medical or live-streamed controversies. He flinched when anyone asked his credentials. His hand shook sometimes, unpredictably. His marriage had dissolved. His medical license was permanently restricted, neutered down to a consultative role, useless for all practical purposes. He'd become the cautionary tale he'd tried to create for someone else. Natalie Hayes stood in her dress blues at the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, the faded unit patch, the one she'd sewn inside her jacket 3 years ago, now pinned proudly to her shoulder as captain. Her daughter held her hand, not quite understanding the ceremony, just knowing that her mother was different in this uniform, that something essential had shifted back into alignment. The Colonel, moving slowly, his burned scars visible on his neck, approached with new orders. But first he shook her hand, his grip steady. "Welcome home, Reaper," he said. The photograph captured it all, Captain Natalie Hayes in dress blues, her decoration commendation in one hand, her daughter's hand in the other, the unit patch visible where the whole world could finally see it. The Colonel's knowing smile in the background. 2 soldiers who'd saved each other when it mattered most. When it cost everything. When integrity was worth more than a comfortable lie. The Department of Defense announced reforms at Cedar Creek Medical within 60 days. A new Veterans Affairs Trauma Wing. Mandatory training for all staff on scope of practice regulations that protected nurses, not imprisoned them. An apology issued by hospital administration, carefully worded, legally vetted, but an apology nonetheless. The board offered Natalie the position of Director of Trauma. She declined. Instead, she requested something else, to work the day shift in the trauma bay, where she could be present, hands-on, saving lives without the politics. Where she could be a nurse first and everything else second. That's where they found her now, checking vitals on a Tuesday afternoon, her scrubs clean, her hand steady, moving through Cedar Creek Medical like someone who'd finally come home. A young resident, fresh out of medical school, idealistic, unaware of the history layered into these corridors, watched her work. "How'd you get so good?" he asked. Natalie didn't look up from her patient's monitor. "Years of practice," she said. "And knowing what matters." The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. For 6 months, she'd swallowed her real identity. She'd let insults accumulate like scar tissue. She'd watched Dr. Pierce weaponize paperwork and policy with the precision of a surgeon wielding a blade. What saved her wasn't being stronger or faster or smarter, though she was all three. What saved her was having someone, the Colonel, his fractured loyalty, his soldier's integrity, who recognized her for what she actually was. And then having institutions powerful enough, once they knew the truth, to correct course. To dismantle the machinery of cruelty. To force accountability on people who'd never expected it. Her phone buzzed at 3:38 p.m. A text from a number she hadn't had in a very long time. "Coffee? I hear you're hiring for the clinic up in Asheville." The Colonel. Moving on. Healing. Carrying his own scars forward. She smiled, small, barely visible, the kind of smile that only comes when you've survived something and are still standing. "I need some jello first," she typed back. He responded with a single emoji, a heart. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your full story, I want to hear about it in the comments. And if you've ever had to hide who you really were just to do your job, please subscribe so more people understand what that costs. Because the Natalies of the world, the quiet ones, the capable ones, the ones who don't flinch, they deserve to be seen.